Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay. Never comes again, another day like yesterday. Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to jump into a conversation that comes up a lot for therapists, especially who deal with developmental trauma, which, by the way, 99% of therapy really ends up boiling down to developmental experiences because it is what programs us for how we interact. But you get situations where someone has been badly hurt by a family member. Sometimes we may be talking about a period of 6 months or a year, a couple of years of molestation, other types of abuse in which that's been lied about and suppressed, and maybe the victim never spoke about it. They were too ashamed or they were scared, and that thing remains, and that person still maybe some way operates in that family system. And there's this person in that family system who did something that was incredibly destructive and caused a lot of pain and struggle for the victim. And so there are conversations that feel complicated when topics like that come up, but it can be vastly simplified. It doesn't make it easier. It doesn't mean that it's easy, but it can be much simpler and more clear if we separate out what the individual components of the situation are. And so, to be more concrete, what I mean by this is people who come into therapy generally are struggling, or the human race, right? When people behave badly and when people get victimized, we struggle with the idea, of forgiveness or punishment, sort of a moral or legal response to what this is. And then we struggle with what behaviors we're going to choose, which can be a legal response. What are the behaviors? Like, what do I actually do, say, act, not do, not say, behaviors I choose to avoid. And then there are outcomes. So there are these three components in the situation. And I want to start with the component that, well, let me start by saying this. I'm not an overtly religious person. I really like ethics. Part of what I loved about philosophy was really thinking through ethical issues and applying logic to it. But I'm not in any way, shape, or form an ethical leader or a spiritual leader. So I'm just speaking as a fellow human being. Yes, I think about this a lot because I'm a therapist and because this comes up, but I seek to help, practically speaking, more than I speak with any moral authority on the situation. So, accept what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But this is how I break it down and how I apply it with myself and with other people and with people who come in for help in my practice. So, in my opinion, the first issue is that the idea of forgiveness or the idea of morality may have been corrupted by religion. And maybe it's not even religion, and maybe it has nothing to do with God, and maybe it has nothing to do with what your religious book actually intends. But human society tends to corrupt things. And so the first thing I want to start with saying is that one of the reasons people struggle with quote unquote forgiveness is because they have been taught, or they've come to view forgiveness as a moral act, as in forgiving someone who's badly harmed me and been extremely unjust, for whom society has not recognized that injustice, and there's been no punishment, there's been no repercussions for that person because of their behavior. people come to believe that forgiveness is this moral act, that I should forgive because it makes me a better person. Again, I'm not speaking as a religious leader or as a moral leader, but what I'm saying is how the human condition works and how humans work. In my opinion, forgiveness is not a moral question. And I'm not the first person saying this, right? So this is not some revolutionary idea that I'm introducing. I'm just introducing that I have to talk through it in sessions, and this is something that a lot of people struggle with. One of the reasons people feel that, well, one of several reasons why people struggle with forgiveness is they're already starting with a judgment. If I'm angry or resentful or feel defensive or still feel scared or still feel reactive towards, say, someone who molested me, who's still in the family and the rest of the family doesn't know, and or people are even in denial, et cetera, the fact that I feel a reaction to that, let's put a pause on that for a moment. Sorry about that. Was a call from my wife. Usually I try not to interrupt, but whatever. So forgiveness. So the first challenge with forgiveness is people see it as a moral question, and they're already judging themselves. I am not a moral person, or I lack some religious quality or some quality of personality that allows me to forgive people, and so I should forgive this person. You know, this is maybe what Christianity tells me to do, or what general social morality tells me to do. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge relates to repercussions or punishment. People believe that they have some feeling that forgiving someone, in fact, entitles them to that behavior and removes consequences. And thus, for a lot of traumatized people who were traumatized badly or victimized when they were children, there's this huge resistance that we feel, because if you've healed, if you're in a process of healing, you've learned to value and love the traumatized child inside, and you've learned to value and respect who that child was who was being badly hurt, and you've learned to hold the bully or whomever responsible for what they were doing. And then forgiving almost feels like an act of violation of yourself as a child, or it feels like an act of self-violation, almost as if you're saying, well, it doesn't matter that it happened. This should be let go. And if I was a good person, I could just let it go. So if you have healthy instincts of self-love and self-respect, your brain and your body is going to fight that. If that's the meaning and the belief that you bring to it, your brain and your body's not going to let you do it. And I see people struggle with this. They struggle and they push themselves to forgive, and they might be in sort of a quiet, graceful state, and they're like, you know, I think I forgive them. And then the person will do something to them again or make some comment, and the anger comes up, maybe even rage, and they're like, oh my God, what's wrong with me? I thought I had forgiven them. And so we have to start with, when we talk about forgiveness, we have to start with separating two things. In my opinion, number one, forgiveness, there's the bloody balloons. Maybe I'm never going to find where that is. Like, I'm just busy and I never go in and find out what that stupid thing is, where if I give a thumbs up, it has put some emoji. And if I do this, it does a celebration, whatever. So we have to start with two separations. In my opinion, number one, forgiveness is not a moral issue. And I say this from the humility of just being a human being. I'm not God. You're not God. It's not my place to apply a moral opinion to what somebody did or not. Or I just simply don't have the wisdom, and I don't have the perspective, and I'm not big enough. I'm this subjective, small creature on the face of this planet, and I get hurt by things and I struggle with things and I have limitations. And so I don't think that me or you or anybody, even if you are a victim, has the divine authority to have a moral judgment about what a thing is, though you have a right to care about yourself and defend yourself, right? So, in my opinion, the first thing is that forgiveness is not about morality. You're not a good person or a bad person, depending on whether you can forgive someone or not forgive someone, right? So, we want to separate that, and then I'll talk more about that. The second separation is forgiveness is not a state of behavior. So being in a state of forgiveness and letting go of what someone did to you does not in any way, shape, or form dictate your behaviors if this person becomes a threat now or again in the future. So let's use a thought experiment where we use a really extreme example to demonstrate that the behaviors that you choose as a limited, humble human organism on the face of this planet, that being in a state of forgiveness or being not in a state of forgiveness has no relationship to the actions that you will take. Remember, we were setting aside, there's the state of forgiveness, then there's the actions that you may take, and then there are the outcomes out there in the world, right? There's these three components that get confused, that people get confused when they talk about it. So we're going to do a thought experiment. Let's say in a book I read once, there was a man who had a father who was extremely dysfunctional, emotionally and psychologically disturbed, and his father raped and violently assaulted him on and off for his entire childhood. When I say violently, I mean inflicting permanent injury. And this person left home. This was in a book, right? So this is, I'm not discussing a particular client's experience. It may even been a made up scenario in a book of case studies. This person moved away from home, separated, et cetera, et cetera. There was maybe a decade of time, and this person is in the late 20s, maybe early 30s. And the father, very contrite, reaches out and says, I know things were really bad, and I would like to meet with you and talk. And though worried, this person ultimately agreed, okay, we'll meet in a parking lot in my car, or right, just sort of like trying to game the situation to just see like what's the deal. Ultimately, the outcome was the father insisted on a sexual favor, and when the victim said no, the father violently assaulted him again and broke his teeth on the steering wheel, hitting his head, and the person had to escape the situation. Being in a state of forgiveness has nothing to do with the actions you may take if someone is that disturbed and violent. In that case, that person could have been in a state of perfect forgiveness and at the same time could have reacted with healthy self-love and self-care and self-defense, and could have beat his father until his father was unconscious in order to escape that situation. And that is no reflection on whether or not you are in a state of forgiveness. So I'm using an extreme example. Defending yourself, rightly defending yourself against violence and maybe we could call just evil intent or extremely ignorant and unconscious animal behaviors directed at you, defending yourself against that has no reflection on whether you're in a state of forgiveness or not. Now, I'm going to complicate it a little bit and say, in fact, if that person had been in a state of forgiveness, they would never have agreed to the meeting, because a state of forgiveness means fully and completely understanding who and what that other person is. And when you fully understand who and what that other person is, with no rancor, with no anger, you would never agree to meet that person, right? So my argument, meaning no judgment, but my argument as a therapist is that person, given that childhood, would never have agreed to meet face to face. Maybe if someone could have advised him, would have just said, you should maybe have a phone conversation, or you should meet in a place where you're going to have a distance of 5-8 feet and talk, and there's a lot of other people around, right? So the agreement to meet somewhere where the father could again engage those behaviors shows that there was still a traumatized son in there who was really, really hoping, who was coming for some rapprochement, I don't know if that's the correct word, but was hoping that this father would show up with a little grace and would actually apologize, which means that there was a trauma child in there going, please, daddy, please still show up. What that means is that person still doesn't really understand what happened to them in childhood and does not understand the kind of person who could do those things. And I don't mean that judgmentally. Like, you need to understand who that person is. And if you do, you will not agree to meet them, right? So in this extreme example, and I apologize, I should have given a trigger warning. That's a really violent and disturbing example. But in that extreme example, what I'm arguing is that being in a state of forgiveness has nothing to do with whether you will apply consequences or be assertive or navigate someone who's a toxic narcissist or defend yourself or do things that makes the other person uncomfortable, right? State of forgiveness has no relationship to that or not that, to the decisions, to the ways in which you will work things out. So this is the same thing where religion or maybe a divine mandate can tell you, hey, this is the state of how things should be. This is a divine state, that society should be this way. These are the rules. But you will see that humans still have to engage their own logic, their own reason, their own grace, their own way of doing things to invent solutions that then propagate out, where we make laws and we make rules and we say, this is how this thing is going to happen. This is how we're going to work out what it means to be kind to someone. This is how we're going to work out what is considered fair. And then we're going to follow these rules. We're going to follow the letter of these laws in an attempt to honor the spirit of the law. So humans still have to work that out. You still have to work out how you're going to behave and how you're not going to behave, and what best reflects your internal state and your relationship to that past and to that history. So, state of forgiveness has nothing to do with the actions you take or do not take. And in line with that, the state of forgiveness has nothing to do with whether or not consequences are applied to the perpetrator or not. A violent perpetrator may be in court and their victim may show up in court and tell the judge, Your Honor, I'm in a state of forgiveness for this person. I let this go. I harbor no ill will towards them. And the court may say, that's fine for you, but society has a relationship to violent offenders, and this person is going to do 10 years in the state penitentiary. Consequences, social contracts, whatever, that stuff is very, very complex, often complicated, and it's still going to be worked out, and it's going to be worked out based on our best awarenesses and on our best, based on our cultures and our history and precedent and et cetera. And that's always going to be complicated, and it's always going to be an open dialogue. But the important thing with forgiveness is the state of forgiveness has no relationship to whether someone else suffers consequences for what they did or they do not. So we can't, many people say, well, I'm going to forgive my father, I'm going to forgive so and so, and then they set a meeting and they try to kindly and gently say, you did these things and this is how it hurt me, and then the person behaves badly again and says, well, you're full of crap, you were always too sensitive, I don't even think that happened, screw you, you're an idiot, and the person leaves and they're like, I came with forgiveness and blah blah. No, you didn't come with forgiveness, you came pretending with forgiveness, but hiding an underlying need and demand that that other person take responsibility for themselves and apply consequences to themselves, which shows you don't know who that person is. You didn't pay attention to who they were your entire childhood while they abused you and how they lied about it and gaslit you. And now 10 years later, you're pretending that they're suddenly a different person and you're not in a state of forgiveness. But leave that aside, right? That's me being a therapist and just going, hey, there's stuff for us to work on if that's what you think. Like you're not listening to who this person really is. But the point is, that has no relationship to a state of forgiveness, whether or not consequences are there. So when people go and they try to elicit a genuine apology from the parent, but they're hiding underneath their state of forgiveness, they're hiding this expectation, they're not in a state of forgiveness. What they're in a state of is, you hurt me, I am still a victim of you, and I'm still handing you the power to hurt me. And I'm expecting you to apply consequences to yourself. I'm in a state of forgiveness, I'm not going to apply consequences, but actually I'm actually demanding that you apply consequences to yourself. Well, they certainly may deserve consequences. Again, I'm not a moral leader, I don't have an opinion, I'm not making a moral argument. They probably deserve consequences. They certainly deserve the consequences that society might apply to them. But for the victim, whether consequences occur or not, and whether you have control over whether there are consequences or not, cannot have any relationship to your state of forgiveness, right? So we broke out the three components. I said there's the state of forgiveness. I'm not super clear this morning. I'm not remembering what my points were. I usually remember once I set the points up. There's a state of forgiveness. Oh, there's the behaviors I engage. So one of those behaviors might be trying to apply consequences, or might be asking for the person to take responsibility or apply consequences, right? So there's the behaviors that I engage or don't engage. And then there's the outcomes. Okay, I think everyone at least pays lip service to understand. I don't think I need to make an argument that you do not have control of outcomes. You do not have control of outcomes. You do not have control of outcomes. As a therapist, I can tell you, people who go to their families or to their abusers or to their parents who were abusive with them, asking for better outcomes or asking for those people to apologize for what they did, I would say easily over 90% you get disappointed. Those people, if those people were willing to abuse a child, do you think they give a crap about you when you're 40? They care even less. All they're doing is trying to time it out. They're trying to get old enough that people would look at them and be like, well, whatever happened, it was a different age, and I'm sure they did their best, and they're really old now. What kind of person would sit there and beat up on someone, their parent who's 80 years old, blah, blah. That's all they're doing, is they're waiting to age this out. They may even be kind of pleasant for a while, but they're not doing it because they're sorry about what they did. If they were sorry about what they did, they would have come to you when you were younger and said, hey, we really mistreated you when you were a child. It was not fair. It was not your fault. And we're very sorry for what we did. And they would say this very genuinely. That didn't happen. You know that didn't happen. So you coming and asking them to take responsibility, 90% of the time, the outcomes are going to be the opposite of what you're hoping for. The opposite, right? So this world of outcomes, you have no control over whatsoever. And so you better not connect your state of forgiveness to whether you have outcomes or not. You better not. You better not be saying, well, I forgive them, and then approaching them and with a feeling of forgiveness saying, you know, you really, really hurt me, but I would like to have a relationship. And then they behave badly. And then you're in anger and rage and you feel violated that you came so genuinely and they continue to be narcissistic and abusive. Well, that means you're not in a state of forgiveness. What that means is you're saying, well, I'll be in a state of forgiveness if you take responsibility. That's not forgiveness. That's just the transactional nature of the 4 dimensions that we live in. And that's you wanting to have control over external events, and we don't. So this third aspect, we don't have any control over consequences. Our behaviors are not related. Whether we behave or don't, whether we call them to account or whether we don't, whether we create a situation where the legal mechanisms of our society applies consequences or not, has no relationship to the state of forgiveness. Right? Like the extreme example that I used, that person had a right to defend themselves with violence, with extreme violence and prejudice, because their father was assaulting them violently. Again, nobody in their right mind is going to go, oh, a state of forgiveness, you should have just like turned the, no, you shouldn't turn the other cheek. You should do whatever it takes to get out of that situation. So being in a state of forgiveness has no relationship to the actions you take or not, though the actions you take sometimes can reflect whether you are already in that state, right? So let's go back to the core. It's not a moral issue. That's up to God or whomever, whatever. I'm not a spiritual leader. It's not a moral issue. There's no should or should not. It's not connected to the actions I choose to take or choose not to take. I have a right to defend myself. I have a right to assert myself if I'm forced to interact with this person who's never been contrite, has never taken responsibility. And number 3, my state of forgiveness has no relationship to the external outcomes. Because God forbid, most times with an abuser, you never have control of the outcomes. They have control of their outcomes, and they're going to do and say whatever the frick they feel like doing and saying. And if they abuse a child, why would you think that they give a crap when you're 27? Sometimes, I'm not saying it never happens, but I'm telling you as a therapist, it's actually pretty rare. I'm telling you as a therapist, it's actually pretty rare that you have a genuine conversation with real grace where an abusive parent, the more abusive it gets, the more it gets a personality disorder, the rarer it is. The less abusive it was, say it was a parent who was just kind of selfish and self-interested and they sort of evolved themselves. Yes, you get more cases where sometimes you can access that parent and they will actually be genuine, or sometimes it happens on a deathbed. The parent will kind of like let go of everything and be like, look, I was a shitty parent and I'm sorry that I was. But again, as a therapist, I kind of call bullshit. They maintain the lie of themselves as a good parent their entire life. And now that they're dying and moving into the unknown, suddenly they're contrite. Yeah, I don't buy it, but then I'm a therapist, so I'm a little cynical. Whatever, you can take that with a grain of salt, but that's my perspective. Right? So forgiveness has no relationship to control over outcomes, or then you're really screwed. Because if you need the outcome to feel forgiveness, what that means is you're not in a state of forgiveness, A, and B, they're never going to give you the behavior that justifies or entitles you to your state of forgiveness, or very rarely. So you can't bet on that. Okay, so again, this is me. I'm not an ethical or moral leader. I'm not a spiritual leader. I'm a therapist. But there seem to be spiritual repercussions or significance. And also, I'm not the first person saying this. There are wiser, better humans saying this than me. But I'm saying that This is validated over and over and over. I see this reality in therapy. So I'm validating that it's true. I'm not the first person who said it, but I'm validating that it's true. The state of forgiveness, not a moral position, is something you adopt out of love and respect for yourself and out of a desire for freedom. Freedom from anger, freedom from that person dominating your thoughts and dominating your life and dictating your behaviors. Because if you still remember that trauma and you're still in that state of trauma and you're defensive and closed off and hurt, and you don't just act that way with your abuser, you also project that out onto other people and relationships and et cetera, right? And so what that person does dominates your life. Being in a state of forgiveness is an act of self-love. It's an act to entitle yourself to freedom, to freedom of your emotional state, for your emotional state to naturally flow to the events of your life. If you lose a beloved pet, so that you get to grieve cleanly and feel love and honor for that pet that you lost. To feel joy when you have joyful events, when you have a child, or when you get promotion at work that you worked really hard for, and because you were really kind and generous at your job, and you know that it's a reward for you being a good person, and you feel joy. You want freedom to have your own emotional experiences and to have your own emotional state. It is an act of self-love, and it is an entitlement to your freedom, your psychological and emotional freedom, your freedom as a human organism on the face of this planet, as a spiritual being, as a conscious being on the face of this planet. Forgiveness has nothing to do with the person you're forgiving. They have to deal with what would make them behave that way in the first place. And as a therapist, I can tell you that that person is suffering an internal torment and misery that many of us cannot imagine. No one acts that way, especially not towards a child who is not living in misery and torment. No one acts that way. They're already living with their own karma, if you choose to use that word. They're already living with the consequences of their actions and their behaviors and their state of being. So that forgiveness has nothing to do with them. It is, in fact, the act of forgiveness is, in fact, decoupling yourself from a miserable person who's also making you miserable. Right? A state of forgiveness is nothing more than getting up every day and going, my life, my inner state is going to be about how I choose to feel. And I'm going to seek joy. I'm going to seek love. I'm going to seek happiness, creativity, excitement, engagement in life. I'm going to seek a pleasant inner state, and I'm going to maintain a pleasant inner state because it is my entitlement. It is mine. That's what forgiveness is. In my opinion, it's not a moral decision. It's a decision to entitle yourself to your true native state. Your true God-given native state is a state of psychological, emotional freedom to explore life and to take the consequences of your own actions and your own emotions and your own being and how it may impact whatever this reality is with all of these other creatures and conscious beings involved in it, all of them wanting what they want and doing what they do and behaving the way they behave, and you throwing your stuff in the mix. It's a mess, and it's always going to be a mess. But you're entitled to your own internal state. It's not a moral question. It is your entitlement to your true nature. It is you saying, I entitle myself to my true nature. I choose for my life not to be dominated by the internal state and nature of that person. I choose to be free of their internal state. My life is not about them. It is not for them. It is not of them, even if you are their child or adult child. My life, my consciousness, my internal state is mine to experience, to respond to. Right? That's a state of forgiveness. If you're truly in a state of forgiveness, and this is my argument as a therapist, taking that case study, that example of the person who agreed to meet the Father, I think if you're truly in a state of forgiveness, once you get clear of the anger and rage and the hurt and the things that were inflicted upon you that became part of your internal state, you will clearly see someone like that person's father and go, I'm in a state of love, joy. I would never risk that for someone who clearly verbally never showed that they understood what they did or cared about what they did. In the real case, maybe they did. I don't know. I'm just using a made up situation, right? Why would you risk it? There's 8 billion people on the face of the planet. Okay, your genetic material was inherited from this person who's psychologically and emotionally deeply disturbed and in a state of torment. That father, believe me, lives in emotional hell. I'm not saying that to forgive them or let them off the hook, but I'm saying no one behaves that way towards their own child who doesn't live in a state of permanent misery. So being in a state of forgiveness means we will respond creatively. Now, let's say a person is in a situation, maybe they're 14 and they truly are spiritually advanced and they're in a state of forgiveness, but they're forced to still put up with the abusive parent. Being in a state of forgiveness does not mean that you don't assert yourself. Or let's say you choose to go home for Thanksgiving because you have brothers and sisters and, blah, blah, but an uncle who molested you is coming too, and you've never talked to anybody, et cetera, et cetera. Being in a state of forgiveness and not making your life about your uncle does not mean when that uncle attempts to get you off in another room and just says, well, I just want to give you a big hug, that you don't look at the guy and go, hey, you can go fuck yourself. I know who you are and I know what you are. I'm going to be here and you're going to be here, but you stay the fuck away from me. Or I'm going to stand up in front of the whole family right here. I'm going to calmly, quietly tell them exactly what you did. And maybe you're going to experience some consequences. But if you think I'm going to go into a room with you alone after you molested me when I was a child, you're feeling very confused about who I am. You can assert yourself. And you're not doing it out of rage and to retaliate, and which again makes your inner state about their inner state. You do it out of respect and love for your own inner state. Maybe you experience a little anger or a little firmness of your boundaries. Great. It's out of respect and love for your inner state and for yourself and respect for yourself. And if you did that assertively, and if you worked through your trauma, you may find that the disturbance goes away pretty quickly. Now, again, you have to be super careful. You can't connect it to outcomes. Or if that uncle happens to be confrontational and violent, you may choose not to go. This doesn't mean that there's a specific behavior that indicates that you are in a state of forgiveness. You will know you're in a state of forgiveness when you respect and love and entitle yourself to a calm, joyful inner state, a state of deep respect for yourself as a consciousness. The behaviors you choose or don't choose, the words you choose or don't choose, the responses you choose or don't choose will be made up moment to moment out of that respect. So I'm not modeling a behavior and going, oh, well, then this means you're in a state of forgiveness. No, nobody can tell you that. You should talk it out with yourself. You should talk it out with your clergy, talk it out with a friend, with a family member who you trust, talk it out with your therapist, whomever, talk it out with yourself. Write about whatever it is, but make sure you're starting from, I choose an inner state that is not dependent on my actions towards this person. If I need to, I will defend myself and assert myself, or I will remove myself from the situation out of love and respect for my inner state. But whatever it is, it's driven by respect for that inner state and maintenance of that inner state. And then when it comes to the world of consequences, hey, do not connect your inner state to the world of consequences, or you will live a life of misery, madness, and fuckery. There is no situation. There is no reality in which you attach your inner state to consequences in which other people, in a reality where other people have an inner state, and some of those people have an inner state of torture and suffering and misery, who have completely abandoned all hope, and their only desire, the only pleasure they have in life is to inflict misery on other people. And for a moment, they feel like they have a little bit of power and they don't feel as scared, and they're addicted to that. In that reality, do you really want to attach your inner state of joy and peace, which is a state of forgiveness of all of that? Forgiveness meaning I remove my state from that. Yeah. The world of external outcomes, forget about it. Don't do it. It's nothing but suffering and misery. We get attached to the world of outcomes because when we're abused as children, we desperately want power to respond. Desperately. And we try to respond verbally, and then our abusers will mock us and put us down and accuse us of being too sensitive, or they'll even be physically violent, or they'll accuse us of being belligerent or being troublemakers or creating, whatever. They'll gaslight the shit out of you. And so as a kid, you're being taught slowly but surely that the only hope you have to escape suffering and misery is to be able to respond and to react and to have your reaction respected. Sadly, in a difficult way, as we grow up and we heal from trauma, we must slowly adjust and introduce ourselves to the idea that our inner state must be kept separate and free of outcomes. Because though as an adult, you can build power, you can build influence, you can build assertive behavior, you can learn these things so that you have a tendency to have decent outcomes or neutral outcomes or sometimes even good outcomes. If you attach your right to joy and peace to outcomes in a world full of war and rape and starvation and suffering and anger and rage, not everyone, but there's a lot of it, and there's enough of it to make you permanently miserable. So we had those experiences as abused children where we were taught that the only hope we have for inner peace is to be able to respond and to have the same power that our abusers have. I must be able to dominate and control other people. Then I can feel peace. Well, they were teaching you a lie. It's a backhanded learning that the only hope you have to own your inner state is to have control of outcomes. If you connect yourself to outcomes, you're going to live a life of misery and fear. Because even if you have a few good outcomes, let's say you have a police officer who has a flawless arrest record, and everyone this person has arrested has been shown to be a bad person and gets taken to court and is successfully prosecuted. if your identity and your inner state is connected to that record, you're still going to live day to day in fear of losing it. Because you see other officers getting bad situations where it's like, oh, they accidentally arrested the wrong person and it went to court and it was discovered, oh my God, this person was being gaslit and, you know, accused. Maybe it's a domestic violence situation where the woman is violent, but she plays the victim and the husband was arrested. And then ultimately in court, they find out that the woman is out of her mind and she's very cruel and aggressive and violent. And in fact, this guy was falsely arrested. And so now people are like, what's wrong with that police officer? Can't they figure anything out? And suddenly the police officers are being attacked. Well, if you're the police officer with a good arrest record, you live in fear of that happening to you. So if you connect your inner state and your identity to outcomes, even if you're having good outcomes, you're still going to live in fear. You're going to live in fear and a need to control, right? You connect your inner state to external outcomes, you're going to live a life of fear and misery and suffering. Forgiveness. It's not a moral imperative. It has nothing to do with who you are as a moral being. I don't even know what that means to be a moral being. That's up to God. That's up to religion. That's up to your religious leader. I'm just a therapist. I don't have an opinion about that. But I can tell you psychologically, I can tell you the way the human mechanism works. And again, I'm not the first person saying this. There are a lot of people who have said this before. Forgiveness is not about the person who was unjust towards you. Forgiveness is loving and honoring yourself and deciding, I choose to be in an inner state, to have an inner state which is free of anger, these negative states, anger, rage, defensiveness, being cut off from other people, struggling to love my child if my child engages a behavior when they're 2 that my mother or father engaged when they were 35 and raising me. And now I have a trauma response and I'm like, oh my God, what's wrong with my kid? Well, they're just 2. That's why they're acting that way. But your parents felt disturbing because they were acting that way at 35. They were acting like they were 2. Right? So you can't see that because you have that trauma, right? So your inner state is entitling yourself to that clarity, that inner clarity and that state of pleasantness, of love and joy and curiosity and peace inside. That is your true inheritance as a conscious being. That's what forgiveness means. Forgiveness just means entitling yourself to the state that is your right. Peace, joy, love. Getting to experience the consequences that really belong to your behaviors. Right? That inner state has nothing to do with behaviors that you choose or don't choose. If you actually are in a state of forgiveness, if you have an inner state of joy, peace, and entitlement to your own inner state, you will tend to make choices in relationship to abusers and people who behave badly. You will tend to make choices based on love and respect for your own inner state and your entitlement and your right to your own inner state, and also other people's. You will tend to be protective of other people's love and enjoyment in inner state. You will not become reactive, abusive, insulting, or attempt to dominate the abuser, because that only indicates that you still feel victimized and angry, which means you have lost your freedom, which means that person is still dictating your behavior. People who are like, oh, well, you got to fight fire with fire. Maybe, for example, in that extreme case where that person put themselves back in a situation where a violent parent became violent with them again, well, they may need to use violence to extricate themselves from that abusive situation. But most of the time, that's really someone who's still hurt, who's still enslaved to the abuser's behavior, enslaved to the abuser's inner state, who's retaliating to try to punish them and force them to acknowledge that you're a jerk. Well, guess what? That abuser knows they're a jerk. They feel like a jerk. That's why they act that way. You're not doing anything. You can't abuse an abuser and have them go, oh my God, what was I doing? They are an abuser exactly because they are in a state of abuse. They live miserably. They're miserable. And someone treated them miserably. All they did was go, I've been treated so miserably for so long that I believe that reality is people who treat other people miserably but have the power, or the person who's the victim. And they're like, well, I'm just not interested in being the victim. So I'm going to be the person who abuses. End of story. That's all there is. That's all that happened for them. So if you abuse them, they're like, yeah, I know that's the system. You're not convincing them of anything. You're actually convincing them that they're right. This is how it works. Right? So when people say fight fire with fire, or most of the time when we're trying to react to or apply consequences, it is because we have already lost our inner state. We've given up the freedom to our inner state. But if we're in that inner state of entitlement to our freedom and joy, we can choose any behavior that truly honors that. And we will tend to have neutral or decent outcomes. Not always, but we'll tend to have a little bit better outcomes. And then lastly, the world of outcomes and consequences, don't even pretend that you have control over it, and do not connect your inner state to that. Being in a state of forgiveness, of entitlement, of freedom to your own inner state has no relationship to the world of outcomes. If you attempt to connect those two things, you are going to live a life of nothing but misery and psychological and emotional imprisonment. I promise you. I speak from experience. I'm the therapist who, if I am helpful to people, it's because I've made about every psychological and emotional mistake you could ever imagine. Anytime I'm saying, hey, it's probably not a good idea to do this, it's not because I read a book or I'm just smart. It's because I already did that multiple times and learned the hard way. It doesn't work. There's no good outcome. There's none. There's no good outcome. So, forgiveness is being motivated by being entitled to feeling that your most beautiful inheritance as a conscious being is freedom for your inner state, that you live in a state of love and joy and peace and creativity and interest and excitement and engagement in life and a desire to be present to life. You never decide that there's a behavior or an action that means that inner state. There is no behavior. The behavior is this complicated thing that gets worked out second to second, minute to minute. And the only way you can try to manage that behavior inside the complexity of society and the difficulty of other people and, you know, your own emotional rate, blah, 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 is to just start with your inner state of joy and peace, entitlement to that. And that will tend to direct you to behaviors and actions that are respectful of your own inner state. And that's the only motivation you should ever have. Respect for your own inner state of peace and joy. And when you have that on lockdown and you really, really have made a practice of that, you can begin offering that and attempting to help others and attempting to defend others' inner state of peace and joy. Right? And then complete separation. Never, 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 never confuse your inner state of peace, joy, and love. Never attach it to the world of outcomes. Because especially if you're dealing with an abuser, with a chronic abuser, well over 90% of the time, you will never have an outcome that isn't more abuse, more gaslighting, more negativity, more denial, more lying. I wish for you a state of true forgiveness. When I say forgiveness, I mean that you are psychologically and emotionally free to maintain your own inner state of joy, peace, love, excitement, interest, engagement in life. And that drives your choices and behaviors and your words. Of course, I wish for you good outcomes, but I don't have control of that. You don't have control of that. Nobody does that I know of. This is what I wish for you. Divorce the word forgiveness from morality, divorce it from any specific behaviors, divorce it from outcomes. It has no relationship. It is simply an inner state of entitlement to your freedom of emotion, your freedom of state of being, so that you get to pursue or be in a state of joy, peace, love, interest, engagement, curiosity, excitement. Grief, sadness, loss, when those are the experiences you've had, that you get to have a genuinely honest human response to the experiences that you're having. I wish this for you. All that in the word forgiveness. All right. Love you guys. I will see you next time. Take care.
Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.